Rules exist for a reason. Break them again, and you're finished. Those words echoed through the sterile hallway like a final sentence, each syllable striking Sarah Matthews deeper than the last. She stood still, her fingers trembling as she slowly unpinned her hospital badge, the one she'd worn proudly for 3 years. 3 years of long shifts, sleepless nights, and endless sacrifices, all for this moment. All to watch it get taken away in silence. She placed the badge in her supervisor's hand, barely hearing the rest. Her heart was still pounding, not from fear of losing her job, but from the moment that had led her here. Just an hour earlier, she was sitting alone in the hospital courtyard, finally allowing herself a few moments of rest. The morning had been relentless, as usual. Vital signs, charting, medication rounds, it never ended. Her stomach growled, reminding her she hadn't eaten since 5 a.m. But even then, she couldn't fully relax. That's who Sarah was. Always alert, always watching. So when she noticed an elderly man in a veteran's cap staggering across the parking lot, something inside her clicked. She had no idea who he was, just that he looked off, his steps uneven, his breathing labored. And then, suddenly, he dropped, collapsed right there on the pavement. There was no one else around. No doctors. No code team. Just Sarah. She didn't hesitate. Her sandwich hit the ground, and she sprinted to his side. No pulse. No breath. His lips turning blue. She didn't have time to weigh the consequences or wonder what the policy said. Her training kicked in. She began chest compressions, steady and strong, counting each one under her breath. 2 minutes passed, and still she didn't stop. Her arms ached. Her knees burned against the asphalt, but she kept going, until finally, the man gasped for air. Help arrived soon after. The veteran was loaded onto a gurney, rushed into the ER. Sarah, breathless and shaky, looked down at her hands. They were red and sore. Her break was long over, and the day had only just begun. She didn't know that someone had seen it all from above, that a pair of eyes had been watching her every move from a window on the second floor. She didn't know that those minutes would unravel her entire routine, or that within the hour, she would be called into the nurse manager's office, where her actions, heroic to most, would be called a violation of hospital protocol. Now, standing in the dim light of the hallway, badge surrendered, Sarah wasn't thinking about policies or consequences. She was thinking about her mother, who depended on her for medication. She was thinking about the rent due in 5 days. She was thinking about how doing the right thing had just cost her everything. And yet, in the corner of her heart, despite the fear, there was a quiet voice. A voice that said, I'd do it again. Because when a life is on the line, hesitation is the true risk. Sarah Matthews wasn't the kind of nurse who made headlines. She didn't chase praise, recognition, or accolades. Her mornings began before the sun even considered rising, slipping into the hospital parking lot at exactly 5:55 a.m., coffee in one hand, her worn canvas bag slung over her shoulder. By 6 a.m., she had already changed into her scrubs, tied her hair back into a no-nonsense bun, and was reviewing patient charts like clockwork. This was her rhythm, efficient, steady, reliable. To her patients, she was a gentle presence in the chaos. To her colleagues, she was the dependable one, always on time, always stepping in when someone needed help, even if it meant staying late or skipping breaks. She wasn't the loudest voice in the room, but she was often the calmest. Her touch, her tone, her ability to remember small details, a patient's birthday, a favorite blanket from home, or the fact that one elderly man only drank his coffee if it had exactly 2 sugars. All of that made her unforgettable, even if she never asked to be remembered. But beneath her steady exterior was a life held together by determination and sacrifice. At just 28, Sarah had become the sole provider for her small family. Her mother, once a vibrant elementary school teacher, had been forced to retire early after rheumatoid arthritis slowly stole her mobility. The once lively woman who used to decorate classrooms and read bedtime stories now spent most of her days in bed, her hands too swollen to even open a jar, her knees aching from every step. Sarah had never once complained. She split her income between the essentials: rent for their modest 2-bedroom apartment, utilities, groceries, and her mother's growing list of medications and treatments. The numbers never worked out perfectly, but somehow she made it stretch. That often meant skipping meals herself, driving an old car with a persistent check engine light, and putting off anything remotely considered self-care. When her shoes wore thin, she lined them with newspaper. When the heating bill spiked in winter, she added an extra blanket to her bed and insisted her mom take the heater. And yet, no one at the hospital would have guessed how close she always lived to the edge. Her smile never cracked, even when her paycheck barely made it to the end of the month. She listened to patients like they were old friends, stayed an extra 10 minutes with the ones who were lonely, and brought an old novel for the pediatric wing after noticing the bookshelf was empty. Once, after her shift, she helped a confused elderly man who was trying to navigate the maze of hospital corridors alone. No one had asked her to. She just saw someone in need and acted. Sarah didn't view these things as extraordinary. To her, it was simple. You help where you can. You care even when no one's watching. That's just how she was raised, and perhaps how she was wired. So on that particular afternoon, when she saw a stranger collapse in the parking lot, her instinct to run and help wasn't a deviation from her character. It was the very essence of it. Helping others wasn't just her job, it was her heartbeat. Even if, at times, it came at the cost of her own well-being. Because Sarah Matthews had always chosen people over policies. That was who she was, long before anyone was watching. Sarah Matthews wasn't the kind of nurse who made headlines. She didn't chase praise, recognition, or accolades. Her mornings began before the sun even considered rising, slipping into the hospital parking lot at exactly 5:55 a.m., coffee in one hand, her worn canvas bag slung over her shoulder. By 6 a.m., she had already changed in her scrubs, tied her hair back into a no-nonsense bun, and was reviewing patient charts like clockwork. This was her rhythm, efficient, steady, reliable. To her patients, she was a gentle presence in the chaos. To her colleagues, she was the dependable one, always on time, always stepping in when someone needed help, even if it meant staying late or skipping breaks. She wasn't the loudest voice in the room, but she was often the calmest. Her touch, her tone, her ability to remember small details, a patient's birthday, a favorite blanket from home, or the fact that one elderly man only drank his coffee if it had exactly 2 sugars. All of that made her unforgettable, even if she never asked to be remembered. But beneath her steady exterior was a life held together by determination and sacrifice. At just 28, Sarah had become the sole provider for her small family. Her mother, once a vibrant elementary school teacher, had been forced to retire early after rheumatoid arthritis slowly stole her mobility. The once lively woman who used to decorate classrooms and read bedtime stories now spent most of her days in bed, her hands too swollen to even open a jar, her knees aching from every step. Sarah had never once complained. She split her income between the essentials: rent for their modest 2-bedroom apartment, utilities, groceries, and her mother's growing list of medications and treatments. The numbers never worked out perfectly, but somehow she made it stretch. That often meant skipping meals herself, driving an old car with a persistent check engine light, and putting off anything remotely considered self-care. When her shoes wore thin, she lined them with newspaper. When the heating bill spiked in winter, she added an extra blanket to her bed and insisted her mom take the heater. And yet, no one at the hospital would have guessed how close she always lived to the edge. Her smile never cracked, even when her paycheck barely made it to the end of the month. She listened to patients like they were old friends, stayed an extra 10 minutes with the ones who were lonely, and brought an old novel for the pediatric wing after noticing the bookshelf was empty. Once, after her shift, she helped a confused elderly man who was trying to navigate the maze of hospital corridors alone. No one had asked her to. She just saw someone in need and acted. Sarah didn't view these things as extraordinary. To her, it was simple. You help where you can. You care even when no one's watching. That's just how she was raised, and perhaps how she was wired. So on that particular afternoon, when she saw a stranger collapse in the parking lot, her instinct to run and help wasn't a deviation from her character. It was the very essence of it. Helping others wasn't just her job, it was her heartbeat. Even if, at times, it came at the cost of her own well-being. Because Sarah Matthews had always chosen people over policies. That was who she was long before anyone was watching. It was just past noon when Sarah finally stepped outside. The hospital courtyard, though modest, was her sanctuary, a quiet patch of green tucked between gray walls and steel doors. It offered a rare moment of peace in a place that never truly slept. The spring air was crisp, the kind that carried the scent of blooming flowers and freshly cut grass. Sarah found her usual bench beneath a young maple tree and exhaled for what felt like the first time that day. She pulled out her sandwich, unwrapped it slowly, and let her shoulders relax. The sounds of the hospital faded into the background. No call buttons, no overhead pages, no hurried footsteps. Just the chirping of birds and the hum of distant traffic. It was her 15 minutes of calm. And then she saw him, an elderly man, perhaps in his 70s, moving unsteadily through the hospital parking lot. His steps were slow and uneven, and he leaned ever so slightly to one side, as if the weight of the world, or perhaps his past, was pressing on him. He wore a dark blue jacket decorated with military patches, and a cap that proudly read Vietnam Veteran. At first, Sarah assumed he was just walking toward the entrance, maybe to visit someone inside. But something about the way he moved made her pause. His gait faltered, his hand lifted to his chest. Then he staggered and dropped. He collapsed like a tree cut from the base, straight down onto the asphalt. Sarah didn't think. She didn't glance around to see if someone else would step in. She was already on her feet before her sandwich hit the bench. The courtyard exit wasn't far, and she ran faster than she even realized she could. By the time she reached him, the parking lot was silent, almost too quiet. Not a single car door opened. No one was nearby, just a scattering of empty vehicles and this man, motionless on the pavement. She dropped to her knees, fingers already at his neck. No pulse. His lips had begun to turn blue. "Sir, can you hear me?" she said, tapping his shoulders. Nothing. The world narrowed to the sound of her own breath as her training took over. She placed her hands on his chest, found her position, and began compressions. Hard, fast, consistent. 1, 2, 3. She counted under her breath, sweat beading on her forehead. It had been years since she'd had to perform CPR outside of a controlled setting. Out here, there was no crash cart, no team of nurses and doctors, no heart monitor beeping rhythmically beside her. Just her hands, her breath, and the desperate hope that it wasn't already too late. Seconds passed like minutes. Her arms burned. Her knees dug into the concrete. She didn't stop. And then, he gasped. The sound was faint, broken, but it was there. Color returned to his face in slow, blotchy waves. His chest began to rise and fall. Sarah gently rolled him into the recovery position, whispering reassurances even as her own heart thundered in her chest. "You collapsed, sir. I think it was your heart. Help is coming. Don't try to move." A voice called out behind her. A hospital staff member, alerted by a bystander, had summoned the emergency response team. Within moments, a gurney appeared, flanked by 2 ER techs. They took over quickly, lifting the veteran with practice care and wheeling him back toward the building. Sarah watched them go, her hands still trembling. Her break was long over, but the thought hadn't even crossed her mind until now. She wiped her palms against her scrubs and stood up slowly, her muscles stiff and aching. No one had said a word to her. No one had thanked her. No one had even asked what happened, and she didn't expect them to. What Sarah didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have known, was that someone had been watching. High above, from one of the windows overlooking the courtyard and parking lot, a figure had stood silently, witnessing everything. But at that moment, as Sarah made her way back toward the hospital doors, all she knew was that a man who might have died was breathing again. And that was enough. Sarah barely had time to settle back into her unit before the storm hit. She slipped behind the nurse's station, hoping to quietly return to her tasks, but the tension in the air gave her away. Nancy, the charge nurse, glanced up from her clipboard with a concerned frown. "Miss Winters has been paging for her pain meds," she said, not unkindly. "Where were you?" Sarah opened her mouth to explain, but before she could speak, A voice cut through the corridor like a cold wind. Sarah Matthews. My office. Now. Patricia Simmons, the nurse manager, stood at the end of the hallway, arms folded, her expression unreadable. Sarah's heart sank. She followed in silence, every step echoing like a warning. Colleagues glanced up from their stations, watching as Sarah trailed behind their stern-faced supervisor. The walk to Patricia's office felt longer than it was, like being led to judgment. The door closed behind them with a soft but final thud. "Sit," Patricia said, gesturing sharply to the chair across from her desk. Sarah sat on the edge, back straight, palms resting stiffly on her knees. "Miss Simmons," she began, "if this is about the man in the parking lot, I already know," Patricia interrupted, her voice clipped. "You performed CPR? Outside? Off duty? Without notifying the emergency team or getting clearance? On hospital grounds?" Sarah blinked. He wasn't breathing. There was no time. "I did what I was trained to do. And in doing so, you violated hospital policy," Patricia replied, already opening a folder. "Medical procedures are to be performed within designated areas and under supervision. That's the rule. You chose to ignore it. He would have died," Sarah said, her voice tightening. "And what if something had gone wrong?" Patricia asked, looking up. "What if he'd fractured his ribs? If he'd sued the hospital? Do you understand the liability risk?" Sarah felt the heat rise in her face. "So, I should have let him die? Because of a rule? You should have called for help and waited for the emergency response team. There was no time. That's not your call to make," Patricia said flatly. "This isn't the first time you decided to bend the rules." Sarah stiffened. She knew exactly what Patricia meant. Last month, she had stayed 2 hours past her shift to sit with a dying patient whose family never came. A few weeks before that, she'd brought homemade soup for a man in recovery who refused to eat hospital food. Small things, human things, but not, apparently, policy-approved things. "I'm issuing a 3-day suspension," Patricia continued, sliding a document across the desk. "Effective immediately, without pay. It will be noted in your record." Sarah stared at the paper, numb. "3 days?" she whispered. "Please, my mother's medication, her next refill." "Rules exist for a reason," Patricia said, her tone firm. "Break them again, and you're finished. Now your badge." For a moment, Sarah didn't move. Her fingers hovered near the ID pinned to her scrub pocket, her mind racing, not with anger, but with disbelief. She had saved someone's life, and this was the consequence? Her hands trembled as she unpinned the badge and placed it on the desk. "You can collect your belongings from your locker. That will be all." Sarah walked out of the office in a daze, the hallway blurring at the edges. She didn't speak. Couldn't. In the locker room, she sat for a long moment on the cold bench, staring at the floor, trying to summon the strength to hold herself together. 3 days without pay wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a disaster. Her paycheck was already stretched to its limit. The cost of her mother's arthritis meds alone would wipe out what little she had left. Rent was due in 5 days. There was no safety net. She pulled out her phone and forced a smile into her voice. "Hey, Mom," she said softly. "I'll be home early today." Her mother sounded surprised, but cheerful. "Everything okay, sweetheart?" "Yeah, Sahalit. Just a shift change. Nothing to worry about." After hanging up, she sat in silence for a long moment, phone in hand, throat tight. She zipped up her jacket and slung her bag over her shoulder, blinking quickly to keep the tears from falling. As she stepped into the hallway, Nancy was waiting. "I heard," Nancy said gently. "This is ridiculous." Sarah shook her head, trying to deflect. "It's fine." "It's not," Nancy whispered, walking beside her. "You saved that man's life." "I broke the rules," Sarah replied, more tired than angry. "And I knew what that meant." "You did what any good nurse would have done," Nancy said, squeezing her arm. "Call me if you need anything." "Please." Sarah nodded, offering a faint smile she didn't feel, then pushed through the exit doors. The air outside was colder now. The parking lot looked the same as it had earlier, as if nothing had happened. But for Sarah, everything had changed. She took a few steps toward her car, an old Honda tucked away in the far corner, and reached for her keys. "Sarah Matthews?" She froze. The voice was unfamiliar. A young woman in a tailored suit was approaching, tablet in hand, her steps purposeful. "I'm Melissa, from administration," the woman said. "Dr. Harrison would like to see you in his office." Sarah blinked. "Dr. Harrison? The hospital director?" Melissa nodded. "Yes. He asked to speak with you immediately." "I've been suspended," Sarah replied slowly. "I don't even have my badge." "You're authorized to come with me," Melissa said gently. "Please. It won't take long." Sarah hesitated. Her mind spun with possibilities. Had someone filed a complaint? Were they considering firing her completely? The humiliation of being escorted back inside on the same day she'd been told to leave, it was almost too much. But something in Melissa's voice, calm, respectful, made her follow. She didn't know what was waiting on the other side of that polished office door. She certainly didn't expect it to be the man whose life she had saved, or the one who had watched it happen. The elevator ride to the administrative floor felt impossibly long. Sarah stood beside Melissa in silence, trying to keep her hands from fidgeting. Each floor the numbers ticked past made her heartbeat quicken. She had never been to this level of the hospital before. Never had reason to. These were the polished halls, the carpeted offices, the world of meetings, budgets, and department heads. Not a place for a floor nurse, and certainly not for someone under suspension. The elevator chimed, and they stepped into a quiet corridor lined with framed awards and photographs of smiling doctors. Everything was glass and wood and professionalism. Melissa stopped in front of a heavy door with a nameplate in gold letters. "Dr. James Harrison, MD, Hospital Director." She knocked once and opened the door. "Miss Matthews is here, sir." From behind a large desk near the window, a man stood. Tall, with silvering hair and a calm presence that felt more clinical than cold. "Thank you, Melissa," he said with a nod. "Please come in, Miss Matthews." Sarah stepped forward, her nerves wrapped tightly around her like a second skin. She braced herself for another lecture, another reprimand. Maybe this was protocol, an administrative review before her final termination. "You can sit," he offered, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. She sat, unsure whether to make eye contact or keep her gaze lowered. "Dr. Harrison, if this is about the suspension, I understand the policy. There wasn't time to wait. I didn't think. I acted." He raised a hand gently, not in dismissal, but to pause her. "I'm not here to question your actions, Miss Matthews," he said. "In fact, I asked you here because I saw everything." Sarah blinked. "Saw?" He turned toward the large window behind him, the same one that looked out over the courtyard and the staff parking lot. "From this office. I was standing right here when it happened." Her mind traced the timeline. Of course, his office overlooked the very place where the man had collapsed. He'd been there the whole time? "I watched you drop your lunch and run. I saw you kneel beside him. Stark impressions. No hesitation. No backup. Just you and a stranger and the will to save him." Sarah didn't know what to say. She sat frozen, uncertain of whether he was commending her or preparing to list additional violations. He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he asked quietly, "Do you know who that veteran was?" Sarah shook her head slowly. "No, sir. I didn't get his name. I just knew he needed help." Dr. Harrison's face softened. A small, almost sad smile touched the corner of his mouth. "His name is Robert Miller," he said. 72 years old. Served 2 tours in Vietnam. And he's my father. The words didn't register at first. "Your father?" Sarah's eyes widened. Her heart skipped. She replayed the moment in the parking lot. The uniform cap, the trembling hands, the final gasp of air as he came back. "Yes," Dr. Harrison continued, sitting down slowly behind his desk. "He came to meet me for lunch. I was late because of a board meeting. I watched from this very window as he collapsed, and I couldn't get there in time. But you did." A long silence followed. Sarah's throat tightened. All this time, she thought no one had noticed. That her act, though right, had cost her everything. But someone had seen. Someone who knew exactly how much had been at stake. "I don't know what to say," she finally whispered. "You don't need to say anything," he replied. "You already said everything that mattered when you ran to help a man you didn't know, risking your job, your record, maybe even your future, just to make sure he had one." Sarah lowered her gaze, not out of shame, but from the overwhelming weight of it all. The veteran hadn't just been someone's grandfather or was someone's husband. He had been this hospital director's father. And now, everything was about to change. Dr. Harrison leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled as he regarded Sarah with a look that was no longer formal but deeply personal. The atmosphere in the room had shifted, less administrative, more human. Gone was the cold tension she had braced for. In its place, something almost reverent. "My father suffered a sudden arrhythmia," he said, his voice steady but touched with emotion. The cardiologist said that if CPR hadn't been started immediately, the chances of survival would have dropped dramatically. You gave him those minutes he didn't have on his own. Sarah's breath caught. She hadn't even known his name until moments ago, Robert Miller. And yet she'd held his life in her hands. It wasn't until now, hearing it from Dr. Harrison, that the true weight of what she'd done began to settle in. The director opened a folder on his desk and turned it toward her. Inside were printed pages, notes, and a copy of her employee record. "I took the liberty of reviewing your file before I called you in," he said. This wasn't an isolated moment of compassion. He read aloud softly, not for effect, but with quiet admiration. "You stayed after your shift last month to sit with Mr. Jenkins during his final hours. No family, no one but you. Then there's the physical therapy assistance you gave Mrs. Roderus, well beyond what was required, and during your break no less. And the books you brought to pediatrics. These aren't things we track, Miss Matthews, but they're not invisible either. Especially not now." Sarah didn't know how to respond. She hadn't done those things for recognition. In truth, she had barely thought of them after the fact. It was just what she believed being a nurse meant, seeing people, not just patients. Being present, not just professional. Most employees, Dr. Harrison continued, follow the rules. And rules matter. I don't deny that. But occasionally, someone comes along who reminds us that heart matters just as much. You didn't just react today, Sarah. You responded with instinct, integrity, and compassion. That's not something we can train. It's something we're lucky to find. He rose from his chair and walked over to a small cabinet near the wall. After unlocking it, he returned with a new hospital badge in hand. "This will be active starting tomorrow morning," he said, placing it gently on the desk in front of her. "Your suspension has been reversed. You'll receive full pay for the 3 days you were set to miss." Sarah stared at the badge. Her name was printed in bold, clean font, just like before. Except now, it felt heavier. Not because of the plastic and laminate, but because of what it represented. Her job, her identity, her ability to support her mother, restored with a quiet, unexpected dignity. "Thank you," she said, her voice a near whisper. "I don't know how to repay you for this." "You already have," Dr. Harrison said with a faint smile. "My father is alive because of you. And more than that, today reminded me why I got into this profession in the first place. We need people like you in this hospital. People who don't just follow protocols. They live their purpose." Sarah nodded slowly, absorbing it all. But just as she was about to stand, he added, "There's one more thing." She paused, surprised. What else could there be? Dr. Harrison didn't elaborate immediately. Instead, he looked toward the door, then back at her with something unreadable in his eyes. It wasn't quite mystery, it was possibility. An open door, a shift in the road ahead. "My father has asked to see you," he said. "Room 302. He wanted to thank the nurse who refused to walk away." Sarah's heart gave a small flutter. The man she had saved, the man who had nearly slipped from this world without even knowing her name, was asking for her. And somehow, it didn't feel like an obligation. It felt like closure, like something unfinished was about to find its way to peace. She rose from the chair and picked up her badge, the familiar weight grounding her. And as she followed the hallway toward room 302, she couldn't help but wonder what else had this day set in motion. Because something told her it wasn't over yet. The hallway to room 302 was quiet, the kind of quiet that hospitals often held in their upper floors. Less frantic than the ER, more hushed than the waiting rooms. Sarah walked slowly, unsure of what she'd say. Her badge now clipped once again to her scrubs, like a piece of herself had been returned. When she gently knocked and stepped inside, she found Robert Miller sitting upright in bed, a thin blanket draped across his legs, a monitor beeping steadily at his side. The window was cracked slightly, letting in a breeze that stirred the curtains. He looked older than she remembered from the parking lot. Perhaps it was the hospital lighting or the clarity of daylight, but his eyes were sharp, alive. "There she is," he said with a smile that crinkled the corners of his weathered face. "My guardian angel." Sarah returned the smile, still a little hesitant. "I'm just glad I was there, Mr. Miller." "Robert," he corrected gently. "No need for formalities. Not after what you did." She approached the bed, standing beside the monitor. He reached out a hand, and she took it, his grip surprisingly strong. "My son tells me you got into trouble for saving me," he said, half incredulous, half amused. "It's all sorted out now," Sarah replied with a modest shrug. "Well, good," he said firmly, "because what you did out there wasn't about rules. It was about decency, about doing what's right, even when no one's watching." Sarah said nothing for a moment, simply nodding. There wasn't much to say to something so honest. They talked for a while longer. He told her about his service years, a few stories she suspected were polished with time, but charming nonetheless. When she finally rose to leave, he gave her hand one final squeeze. "Thank you," he said, his voice softening. "Not just for the CPR, but for not hesitating, for seeing a person in need, not a protocol or a problem." Sarah blinked against the sting in her eyes and smiled. "Get well soon, Robert." With a gentle nod, she stepped out, letting the door close quietly behind her. She didn't go far before Melissa reappeared, waiting just around the corner. "Dr. Harrison would like to see you again." Back in the director's office, the air felt different than before. Less formal, more like the beginning of something. Sarah sat as Dr. Harrison reviewed a few documents on his desk, then looked up, his expression thoughtful. "Miss Matthews, are you familiar with our clinical nurse leader program?" She tilted her head slightly. "I've heard of it. It's an advanced leadership position, isn't it?" He nodded. "Yes. It's a role focused on improving patient care across the board, working closely with both staff and administration to bridge the gap between clinical practice and policy." She listened carefully, wondering why he was bringing it up now. "We've had an opening in the program for 3 months," he continued. "Several candidates have applied, many with more seniority. But after what I saw today, and after reviewing your history of patient advocacy, initiative, and compassion, I believe you would be an excellent fit." Sarah sat back, stunned. "You're offering me the position?" "I'm offering you the opportunity to interview for it," he clarified with a slight smile. "But I'll be honest with you. I'm personally recommending you to the panel. And should you accept the offer, you'll find the position comes with regular hours, significantly increased pay, and a real chance to help shape how we respond to moments like the one in the parking lot. Moments where judgment and humanity matter." He slid a folder across the desk toward her. Inside were the job description, expectations, and, at the bottom of the page, the salary. Sarah's breath caught. It was nearly double what she currently made. "Why me?" she asked quietly, her fingers resting on the edge of the folder. "There are others who've been here longer." "There are," he agreed. "But this isn't just about time served. It's about character under pressure. Today, you didn't wait to be told what to do. You didn't weigh consequences. You acted because someone needed you. That's the kind of leadership I want at this hospital." For a moment, Sarah couldn't speak. She thought of her mother, of the mounting bills, of the constant balancing act she lived day to day. This opportunity, this shift, could change everything. She finally looked up and met his eyes. "I'll consider it," she said, her voice steady. "Thank you, Dr. Harrison, for the chance." He nodded, satisfied. "The interview panel meets next Tuesday. I hope to see you there." As she stepped out of the office once again, the hospital felt different. Not just because her suspension had been reversed or because her job had been restored, but because, for the first time in a long while, her future felt like more than survival. It felt like purpose, like momentum, like possibility. 3 weeks later, the hospital lobby looked the same. Patients in wheelchairs, the distant murmur of voices, the faint smell of antiseptic lingering in the air. But for Sarah Matthews, everything had changed. She walked through the staff entrance that morning not as the exhausted floor nurse quietly clocking in at dawn, but as the hospital's newest clinical nurse leader. A polished new badge hung from her chest, its silver trim gleaming under the hallway lights. It still had her name, her photo, but now beside it, a title that carried weight. Authority, responsibility, respect. As she moved through the hallways, familiar faces lit up with smiles and nods of acknowledgement. Even those who hadn't known the full story had heard whispers about what had happened in the parking lot, the suspension, and the sudden meeting with the hospital director. But Sarah didn't walk with arrogance. She walked with quiet pride and the quiet purpose that had always driven her. Only now, she had the platform to make real change. Her first assignment had already begun, something that meant more to her than a promotion ever could. She was tasked with reviewing and developing a new set of emergency response guidelines, ones that didn't just follow policy to the letter, but recognized the nuance of real-life moments. Guidelines that acknowledged what every good nurse knew deep in their bones, that sometimes the right action couldn't wait for permission. She spent her first day listening to nurses, aides, even custodial staff who had stories of stepping up in ways that had gone unnoticed. She took notes not just with a pen, but with empathy, because Sarah understood better than anyone what it meant to act when no one else would. That evening, with her shift complete and her badge still warm against her chest, Sarah didn't go home empty-handed. She stopped by the florist on the corner, picked up her mother's favorite lilies, then swung by the little tie place down the street, the one her mom always craved but they rarely could afford. This time, she didn't have to check her bank account before ordering extra spring rolls. When she walked through the apartment door, arms full, her mother looked up from the couch, startled. "What's all this?" Sarah grinned. "We're celebrating." Her mother raised an eyebrow. "Did something happen?" Sarah placed the flowers in a vase and began unpacking the food. "Let's just say it's been a good few weeks." They ate together at the small kitchen table, laughter mixing with the clink of dishes. The tension that had lived in that apartment for so long, the tightrope of bills, the weight of worry, had finally begun to lift. Later that night, as Sarah cleaned up and prepared for bed, she noticed an envelope tucked inside her mailbox. No return address, just her name in neat cursive. Inside was a simple note on heavy cream paper. "Some people follow rules. Others follow their hearts. Thank you for being the second kind." It was signed Robert Miller. Sarah held the note for a long moment, rereading it, her heart swelling with something deeper than pride. It was validation, not from a supervisor or a system, but from the very life she had saved. She walked over to her bulletin board, carefully pinned the note in the center, and stepped back. Every morning from now on, she would see it, a reminder that in a world full of red tape, there was still room for instinct, for kindness, for doing the right thing, even when it was the hard thing. Sarah Matthews had once been just a nurse. Now, she was a leader. But more importantly, she was still the same person she'd always been, someone who saw people first and rules second. And that changed everything. Sometimes, the world doesn't change in grand moments. Sometimes it shifts quietly in the span of a breath, a decision, a heartbeat. For Sarah Matthews, it happened in the stillness of a hospital parking lot. No applause, no audience, just her and a man in desperate need of help. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't check the rule book. She simply saw a life slipping away and chose to act. That one act, born from instinct and compassion, cost her security, at least for a moment. It challenged everything she thought she knew about her profession, about the system she worked within, about the value placed on doing what's right versus what's allowed. But in the end, it gave her something far greater than what was taken. It gave her clarity. It gave her purpose. And it reminded everyone watching, whether from a second-story window or a quiet hallway, that sometimes what the world needs most isn't someone who knows the rules. It's someone who knows when to rise above them. Sarah's story is about courage, yes, but not the kind that screams or stands on a stage. It's the kind that kneels beside a stranger and presses life back into their chest. The kind that accepts punishment without bitterness and does good without expecting thanks. the kind that makes ripples that reach farther than she'll ever truly know. Her journey didn't begin with a promotion or end with a thank you note. It began with a choice, a single choice to put another human being first. And so, I ask you, have you ever found yourself at that same crossroads? Caught between doing what you were supposed to do and doing what you knew in your heart was right? If Sarah's story moved you, if it stirred something in you, don't let it fade away. Give this story a like and subscribe to Mr. Michael Stories for more powerful tales of real people, real moments, and real choices that shape lives. And in the comments below, leave just one word that captures how this story made you feel. Because sometimes, even the quietest voices deserve to be heard.